It was the last week of August, that weird in-between stretch where summer feels like it's dying and everything around you starts to go quiet. My parents had just moved into a smaller house a few months earlier, on the edge of a little town in upstate New York. It was the kind of neighborhood where every lawn looks the same and the nights are so still that you notice every sound. They bought the place after I left for college, so I'd only visited twice. When I came home for the summer, it still felt like I was living in someone else's house. My room was barely set up, just a bed, a desk, and a few boxes. My parents were heading out for a short anniversary trip that week, leaving me alone to watch the house. Honestly, I didn't mind. I liked the quiet, and it felt good to have a place to myself before the semester started again. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I'd stay up late watching movies, make a frozen pizza, and crash around 1 a.m. But on the 3rd night, something small happened that started to dig at me. Around midnight, as I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard a faint click beneath me, like a latch snapping shut. It was so soft, I almost ignored it. But a minute later, it came again, followed by the sound of something scraping against wood. At first, I thought it might be the pipes or the air conditioning ducts expanding, but the house was old enough that it didn't even have central air. I sat up and listened, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It wasn't inside the walls, it was below me. That confused me because my parents told me this house didn't have a basement, just a small crawl space for wiring and plumbing. I'd even seen the hatch for it outside under the porch, barely big enough to crawl through. Still, the noise sounded like someone slowly dragging something heavy across a wooden floor directly under my room. I got out of bed and walked into the hallway, listening. The moment I stepped out, the noise stopped. After standing there for maybe a full minute, I told myself I was overreacting. Old houses make sounds. I went back to bed, left a small lamp on, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I brushed it off completely until later that afternoon, when I noticed something weird outside. On the side of the house, near the ground, was what looked like an old cellar door, the kind that opens outward with 2 wooden panels. It was almost completely hidden by stacked gardening tools and a few bags of mulch. I could tell my dad had piled them there when he'd been cleaning up the yard, probably without realizing what they were covering. The doors were painted the same dull gray as the siding, but the paint was chipped and there was a rusty padlock on the handle. I bent down to look closer. The lock wasn't new. It was old and weathered. But what caught my eye was the scrape mark on the dirt beneath the handle, as if it had been moved recently. I decided not to tell my parents. They were supposed to be relaxing, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. That night, the sound came back. It started with the same scraping, then a hollow knock, followed by another faint click, like metal tapping wood. It went on for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped again, right after I got out of bed to listen. I didn't sleep much after that. By the next morning, I was certain there had to be something living under there. Maybe raccoons, maybe a stray cat. I grabbed a flashlight from the garage, moved the garden tools, and crouched beside the cellar doors. The lock looked ancient, but to my surprise, when I tugged on it, it snapped clean off. It had rusted through. When I pulled one of the doors open, a stale smell rolled out, that mix of dust, mildew, and old wood that instantly makes your stomach turn. Concrete steps led downward, swallowed by darkness. I shined the flashlight inside and froze. At the bottom of the steps wasn't a crawl space. It was a full basement, unfinished but large, easily stretching beneath the entire house. The air was heavy, thick. My light swept across old furniture, some broken shelving, and piles of junk. Then it landed on something that didn't belong there at all. A mattress on the floor. Beside it were two plastic grocery bags filled with empty water bottles and food wrappers. A small lantern sat next to a half-burned candle. Someone had been living down there. I felt my chest tighten. I should have turned around right then, but I couldn't help looking a little longer. On one of the support beams near the mattress, there were faint markings carved into the wood. At first, I thought they were tally marks, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw words. "Don't let him hear you." That was enough for me. I ran back up the steps, slammed the doors shut, and dragged the mulch bags and tools back over them. I locked the kitchen door, turned off all the lights, and sat in the living room for hours, just listening. No sounds, no movement, just silence. The next day, I called my dad and told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a while, then said he had no idea there even was a basement. The real estate listing never mentioned one. He promised to come home the following day to check it out himself. That night, I triple-checked every lock in the house before going to bed. I even wedged a chair under the front door handle, something I'd only seen people do in movies. Around 2 a.m., the sound came back. Only this time, it wasn't under the floor. It was outside, right beneath my window. I sat up, heart pounding, and killed the lamp. My room went completely dark. The sound was clearer now. Soft footsteps moving across the side of the house, slow and deliberate. Then came the metallic rattle of the cellar doors. Someone was trying to open them. I grabbed my phone, but the screen blinded me in the dark, and when I looked back toward the window, the noise stopped. A second later, I heard something else. Faint breathing, right outside the glass. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. Then, a whisper. Not a voice exactly, but the sound of someone exhaling through their nose, slow and heavy, like they were smelling the air. My stomach turned cold. I waited a few seconds, then jumped out of bed and flipped on every light in the room. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of someone, or something, darting away toward the trees behind the yard. I couldn't make out their face, but they were fast, too fast. I called 911, hands shaking. When the police showed up, they checked the yard and the basement. Nothing. No footprints. No sign of forced entry. They told me it was probably a trespasser or a homeless person passing through. They offered to patrol the neighborhood more frequently and left. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, my parents came home early. My dad and I went outside to check the cellar again. The lock was still broken, but the doors were sealed shut with something thick smeared across the crack, like dried mud or cement. It hadn't been there the day before. When we forced the doors open, the basement looked different. The mattress was gone. The candle was gone. Everything had been shoved into a corner, except for the beam with the carvings. A new line had been added beneath the words. "He heard you." My dad thought someone was playing a prank. He wanted to board the whole thing up, but I couldn't stay another night. I packed my stuff, told them I'd head back to campus early, and left that afternoon. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, my parents haven't mentioned any strange noises or signs of anyone coming back. They said the contractor sealed the cellar completely and poured concrete over the doors. But every time I call, I can't help listening for background noise, for any small sound that might prove the house still isn't empty. Because sometimes, when the phone goes quiet between our words, I think I hear faint tapping. Not from their end, but from somewhere underneath my own floor. I grew up in a quiet little town called Wellington Ridge, tucked somewhere between long stretches of farmland and pine-covered hills. It's the kind of place most people just drive through on their way to somewhere else. Peaceful, sure, but the kind of peace that can start to feel lonely if you sit in it too long. This happened years ago, at the very end of summer, that strange time when the mornings start to feel cool again, and you can almost smell autumn coming. That morning, I was driving to work along County Route 12, a narrow 2-lane highway that cuts through open fields and quiet pastures. Around 15 minutes out, I spotted a car pulled off on the shoulder, a faded light blue sedan, maybe early 2000s model. At first glance, it looked like just another breakdown. But as I got closer, I noticed the engine wasn't running. No hazard lights, no one standing nearby. The car was angled oddly, like it had rolled to a stop halfway into the ditch. I slowed down as I passed, craning my neck to look. No one in the driver's seat, no one in the back, completely empty. Out here, that kind of thing happens sometimes. People hit a deer, get stuck, walk to the nearest farmhouse. I didn't think too much of it and kept driving. By the time I got to work, I'd already put it out of my mind. But on the drive home that evening, the same car was still there, in the exact same spot. Only now the driver's door was hanging wide open. That wasn't how it looked that morning, I was sure of it. I slowed down again, half expecting someone to pop out of the trees or wave me down, but the road was empty. No one walking, no tire marks, nothing. Just that open door swinging gently in the wind. When I finally had a signal, I called the local non-emergency number and told them what I'd seen. The dispatcher thanked me and said they'd send someone to check it out. The next morning, the car was gone. I figured that was the end of it. About a week later, I was having breakfast when I heard a local news anchor mention something that made me freeze. Authorities were investigating a missing person case. A man whose vehicle had been found abandoned along a rural stretch of highway near Edison County. They didn't give a name, but everything matched. The description, the location, even the color of the car. There were no signs of foul play, they said. No witnesses, just a vehicle found on the side of the road. I remember sitting there with my coffee going cold, realizing I might have been the first, and maybe only, person who saw it when it first happened. I tried to move on, but I couldn't. The whole thing wouldn't leave my mind. So I called my brother, Mark, who's a firefighter in the next town over, Silverton. Usually, firefighters and sheriff's deputies pass information back and forth, so I figured maybe he'd heard something. He told me they'd gotten a notice about the car and the missing man, but not much else. The sheriff's office was planning to do a small coordinated search in the area. I don't know why, but I asked if I could tag along. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. It just didn't feel right sitting around doing nothing. A few days later, Mark called back. The search was happening that weekend, and the sheriff's office was fine with a few extra hands. We met early Saturday morning near a turnout by Miller Creek, not far from where the car had been spotted. The air had that first chill of September in it, and everything smelled like dry grass. From the road, the land looked flat, but once you stepped into it, you realized how uneven it really was. Ditches, low hills, thick brush, and tall grass that swallowed your boots when you walked. We split into pairs. I went with Mark. About an hour in, one of the deputies radioed that they'd found something through a break in the trees. We made our way over. That's when we saw it, a small wooden shack, half sunk into the ground. The thing looked ancient, boards warped from years of rain, vines crawling up the sides. From the road, you'd never even know it existed. The door hung open. The metal latch had snapped clean off. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and dust. But there were signs of recent use. Empty water bottles, food wrappers, and a sleeping bag stuffed into one corner. It wasn't homey, exactly, but it looked lived in. One of the firefighters called us over. He'd found something near the back wall. There, just above the floorboards, was a small hole, perfectly round, the wood splintered outward. It looked like a bullet hole. We searched the shack and the area outside for a casing, any trace of blood, but there was nothing, just that one hole. The lead deputy radioed it in, voice tight, and after a short pause, told us to stand down. A few minutes later, he turned to us and said, "Thanks for your help, folks." We'll handle it from here. He specifically told me, since I wasn't law enforcement, I needed to leave the site immediately. I didn't like it, but I left. That evening, I called Mark. He didn't say much at first, just that the police had ordered everyone off the property not long after I left. More units showed up after that. Plain vehicles, no markings, and that was it. After that day, nobody said a word about it again. The local paper ran one short paragraph the following week about the missing person. Then silence. Months went by, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the whole thing had just disappeared. So one afternoon, I drove back out to Miller Creek. I parked on the same stretch of highway, followed the ditch line exactly as I remembered. The terrain looked identical. The same sloping field, same broken fence post. But when I got to where the shack should have been, there was nothing. No wood, no foundation, no sign anything had ever stood there. It was just open field. I spent hours walking back and forth, retracing every path, but it was like the place had been wiped clean. The only explanation I could think of was that maybe the county had demolished it. But why would they bother with some forgotten shack in the middle of nowhere? When I finally gave up and sat back in my truck, the sun was setting behind the hills, and that whole area looked even more deserted than I remembered. That's when I started wondering, what if the shack was never supposed to be found in the first place? I know how it sounds, but when you think about something long enough, your brain starts to turn it over and over, like maybe it's warning you not to dig any deeper. Still, I can picture it clear as day. The walls, the smell, that splintered hole. I know it was real. But every year, when summer ends and that same chill creeps back into the air, I think about that empty highway, that car, and that shack that no longer exists. And I can't help but wonder what was really hiding inside it, and who didn't want us to know. I've always loved being alone in nature. There's something grounding about the silence, the way the world feels untouched and ancient when you're deep enough in the woods. But after what happened to me last August, I don't think I'll ever be able to step foot in a forest again without feeling watched. I live in eastern Washington, right on the edge of the Okanogan National Forest. I grew up here, fishing, camping, hiking. So being in the wilderness always felt natural. My dad had this tradition. Every summer before school started, he'd take me and my brother out camping for a few days. No phones, no TV, just us, a tent, and the sound of wind through the trees. Now I'm 29, living on my own, and I've kept that end of summer camping tradition alive, even if I usually do it solo these days. My girlfriend hates the outdoors, and my dad's too old to trek up steep trails anymore. So, every August, I pack my gear, find a quiet spot, and spend a few days off-grid. Last year, I decided to try somewhere new. I'd been studying satellite images on Google Maps and noticed a clearing deep in the national forest, nowhere near any marked campsites or known trails. It looked perfect, secluded, flat terrain, a small creek nearby. I saved the map offline and planned a 3-day trip. It was about a 2-hour hike from where I parked my truck. The trail disappeared about halfway in, and from there I just followed the compass until I reached that clearing. It was even better than I expected. Open sky above, dense pine forest all around, and the faint sound of running water in the distance. I pitched my tent, set up a small fire ring, and sat down with a cheap, freeze-dried dinner. That first night was peaceful. The air was cool, the stars were out, and the only sound was the occasional crackle of the fire. I remember thinking how crazy it was that a place like this could exist only a few hours from home. The next morning, I decided to hike down to that creek I'd heard. I figured if I could catch a fish or two, I'd feel like a proper outdoorsman again. I packed some water, my little fishing rod, and followed the faint sound of the stream. It took maybe 40 minutes to reach it, and honestly, it was beautiful. Crystal clear water, sunlight breaking through the trees, the kind of spot you'd see on a postcard. Time slipped away faster than I realized. I managed to catch a decent-sized trout, threw it in my cooler, and started heading back. The problem was, I completely misjudged how long the hike back would take. The sun had already dropped below the tree line, and by the time I got halfway, it was getting dark, fast. I turned on my headlamp, following the path as best I could, but the forest looked different at night. The trees seemed denser, the ground less familiar. At one point, I noticed something strange through the branches. A light. A faint, warm glow, moving rhythmically, like someone walking with a lantern. My first reaction was relief. Maybe there was another camper nearby. I yelled out, "Hey there, you camping out here too?" The light stopped immediately. I froze. For a few seconds, it just hung there in the distance, perfectly still. And then, just as suddenly, it went out. The forest went pitch black again. I waited, holding my breath, but the silence was heavier than before. That's when I heard it. This crashing sound, through the brush, not directly toward me, but close enough that I could hear branches snapping in quick succession. Whoever, or whatever, it was, they were moving fast. My pulse shot through the roof. I flicked my headlamp around, but saw nothing except trees and darkness. It didn't make sense. If it was another hiker, why kill the light and take off running like that? I picked up the pace, trying to keep calm, but every sound, every crunch of twigs, set me on edge. By the time I got back to camp, my nerves were shot. I didn't even bother cooking the fish. I just ate a protein bar, zipped myself in the tent, and told myself I'd laugh about it in the morning. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. No idea what time it was. The fire had long burned out. The forest was dead silent. Normally, you hear insects, owls, something. But it was so quiet, it almost rang in my ears. I lay there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what had woken me, when I realized I really had to use the bathroom. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The moonlight was bright, illuminating the clearing. That's when I saw it. A figure was standing about 20 feet from my tent, perfectly still, facing me. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, maybe a tree stump catching the light weirdly. But as my eyes adjusted, I knew better. The shape was wrong, too narrow at the shoulders, too long in the arms. My throat went dry. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. It felt like minutes passed, though it was probably seconds, before I reached for the switchblade I always keep by the tent flap. The metallic click of it opening sounded deafening. That tiny sound must have given me away, because the second it happened, the figure charged. No build-up, no hesitation. Just this full-speed sprint straight at my tent, paired with a scream that didn't sound human. It was this cracked, broken noise, like someone laughing and screaming at the same time. I barely had time to react before the tent collapsed around me. I felt hands, or claws, tearing at my face and chest. I started slashing blindly with the knife, connecting once, maybe twice. Then everything stopped. The figure let out another shriek, higher this time, and bolted into the woods. I sat there shaking, tangled in the collapsed fabric, gasping for breath. It took me nearly 10 minutes to get the tent back upright, enough to crawl inside and lock the blade open in my hand. I stayed awake until dawn, jumping at every sound, every gust of wind. When daylight finally hit, I packed up everything in a matter of minutes. My hands were still trembling as I folded the tent, and I didn't bother following the same path out. I just started walking downhill until I hit a dirt road, then followed it for hours until I finally saw my truck. I didn't stop once. When I got home, I checked my face in the mirror. 3 shallow cuts along my cheek and temple. Nothing deep, but enough to scar faintly. I remember thinking I should call the ranger's office, but what would I even say? That I was camping illegally and got attacked by someone who vanished into the trees. No one would believe that. But here's the thing that still gets me. That lantern I saw. I've been thinking about it ever since. There's no way anyone could have been that deep in the forest without a vehicle or a trail. That part of the woods is completely isolated. No cabins, no campgrounds, nothing for miles. So whoever, or whatever, I saw out there that night, they weren't just lost, they were waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when I look out at the tree line behind my house, I swear I can see a faint, swinging light moving between the pines, just far enough away that I can't tell if it's real.